So we come to the book of Exodus. I think the first thing that we'll do is quickly to sketch through the range of contents in this book. Chapter 1 verse 8 is the turning point, where it says that a new Pharaoh doesn't remember these Habiru, these strangers, that they saved Egypt, and he uses them as slaves in one of his massive building projects. Into that, Moses is born. His call as the sort of lead man for the Lord in bringing the people out comes in the burning bush in chapter 3. Moses confronts Pharaoh, the plagues, the Passover, the Exodus, crossing the Red Sea, the manna and the quail. Chapters 19 and 20, the Ten Commandments are given. Various other laws follow them. 24, the covenant is renewed on the basis of these laws. Chapter 25 onwards, the Tabernacle and its priests, all the regulations concerning that. 32, the rebellion, the golden calf, resulting in a breaking of the Ten Commandments, breaking the actual tablets of stone on which they were written. So chapter 34, Moses has to get a new copy of the Ten Commandments. 35 onwards, the tabernacle is actually built, and the book ends with the glory of God descending on the tabernacle. So the book Exodus tells the story from the statement of the problem to the establishment of a proper people in transit, complete with the manifest presence of God among them. It's an extraordinary achievement, an extraordinary difference between how the book starts and how the book ends. And the details of the story are quite enthralling. Let's start by looking at the covenant itself. In the Genesis session last time, we mentioned that the third and definitive version of the covenant was made with Moses. You might like to read here Exodus 24, the first 8 verses. Ancient covenant-making ceremonies always involved the shedding of blood. Not only was the blood shed in the sacrifice, but, as in verse 8, the resulting blood was often spread over the people or over other objects. And that takes us through all the way to the words in the Last Supper, that when we receive the wine in the communion, we're reenacting the making of the new covenant, reasserting the grace of God which has established this new covenant in Jesus, recommitting ourselves to living within it. There's an interesting move here. As you go from the old covenant to the new, you're going from something external to something internal. In the old covenant, based on the application of rules that come at you from the outside of you, the sign of the covenant also came to the people from the outside. It might have been as crude and as literal as they're being spattered with blood from the sacrificed animals. In the new covenant, based on the creation of a new relationship between the Lord and his people, that's a more inward thing than external. It's then fitting that the sign of that new covenant enters into us and becomes a part of us along with our other food. In verse 7 of this chapter 24, the book of the covenant is read and the people undertake to live by it. We don't have a book called the Book of the Covenant, but the story makes sense if we understand that what was read was a compilation of the laws thus far given. Most people assume that it must have been the material we find essentially in chapters 20 to 23 of Exodus, the Ten Commandments and a selection of other laws. This gives us the position we described last time, that the covenant is established as an act of God's sovereignty and grace in choosing this people who didn't deserve such a privilege, and the people's obligation under the covenant now stretch to something more than just having 8-day-old boys circumcised. The commandments which are now laid down govern worship and lifestyle. Or you could say that their scope addresses both the spiritual and the moral aspects of the people's lives. Take away Exodus, a game that I like to play at a suitably religious party. You can play it for real if you have a really old Bible that is so far past its sell-by that its next move is to be put in the paper recycling. If you've got a Bible that's as old as that, then you can bear to tear it up, and the game involves tearing it up. If you haven't got a Bible like that, you're going to have to do this as a thought experiment. So you take this old Bible and you cut out the book of Exodus. Then the rest of the game consists in your cutting out everything which is tied to the book of Exodus in any way. The sort of reasons you might have for taking bits out. Genesis, once you started reading Exodus, you realise that the basic point of Genesis was to get you as far as the beginning of the story in Exodus. It was the introduction to Exodus, so that's got to go. Leviticus and Numbers are spelling out details of Exodus for which there isn't room in the book of Exodus. Deuteronomy is telling the Exodus story again. The Deuteronomic history is judging how well the people who settled in the Promised Land stuck to their side of the covenant, which is an Exodus thing, so that's got to go. The books of the prophets are pointing out lapses in the people's keeping of the covenant and calling for renewed adherence to the covenant. Well, that's all Exodus stuff, so that's got to go. The book of Psalms is shot through with themes of deliverance. That's an Exodus theme. That's got to go. Job and Proverbs might possibly survive this procedure. The books of Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah, same sort of comments as we made over the D history. They're judging how well people are sticking with the covenant. The Gospels, well, the Gospels are all about a new exodus, a new deliverance, now from the bondage of sin, but a deliverance still. They've got to go. Acts and the Epistles are spelling that out, so they've got to go too. And the book of Revelation is a profound meditation on the Exodus and on the rest of the Old Testament, so that isn't going to stay. There's not an awful lot of the Bible left once you've removed the stuff that is tied in to this central book, Exodus. And of course this isn't just a game. The subject matter of Exodus is central to the Bible, that God delivers his people from bondage even when their own sin has made matters worse. I mean, after the grumblings in the desert, he made them wait 40 years, but he didn't cancel the whole idea of the Promised Land. And in a similar way, our view of ourselves now is as people who have been delivered. I rather like that Jewish style of reading the story of the Exodus as if we were there. You've got a portrayal of that in the film of Fiddler on the Roof, especially in what starts as a love song, Wonder of Wonders, Miracle of Miracles. In typical Jewish fashion, that song refers to being led out of Egypt through the Red Sea as something that happened to us, as if we were there when God gave us manna in the wilderness. And of course the New Testament equivalent to that is that we are the people whose sins are nailed to the cross. We are the people whom Jesus has saved at the cross. So the lesson to us that we should think of ourselves as involved in the crunch events leading to where we are now, we learn that lesson in the Exodus, we apply it when we come into the New Testament story itself. In fact, the Old Testament itself contains a second experience of this sort of deliverance in the ending of the exile in Babylon. We'll focus on that when we come to the second part of the book of Isaiah. that what happens there is that God continues to be the God who delivers his people, even if he must first let them suffer the consequences of their sin. Quite a strong echo of the Exodus experience. And then it really is necessary to see Jesus as the agent of a deliverance which echoes that of the Exodus, but also thoroughly eclipses it. Some people say that the Gospel of Matthew was written in the way it was in order to portray Jesus as a new sort of Moses. I'm never fully convinced by that argument, but I see what they mean. The Gospel of Mark portrays, very vividly portrays Jesus delivering people from evil spirits and diseases. It's a deliverance story. And Paul, of course, majors on the way that Jesus delivers us from sin. These are prominent Exodus motifs reworked in the context of the Jesus event. So the book we're addressing in this session, the book of Exodus, it could not be more important without actually being part of the new covenant itself. A tidbit. The Exodus from Egypt took place in a period which was eventually quite well covered in documents which set out to tell its story. That sort of coverage is given to the nation's history up to the point where Jerusalem was sacked by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. In the period from then until the Old Testament peters out, events are covered in documents much more patchily. We learn snippets from records of some of the prophets' ministries. We learn oddments from the accounts of the works of Ezra and Nehemiah. We can get some help from some of the books that the Jews decided they wanted to keep but were not to be regarded as scripture, the Old Testament Apocrypha. But there is no continuous coverage of this period of the Old Testament history. And the result of that is that the vast majority of people who read the Old Testament have no idea that the captivity in Egypt wasn't the only period when the people were held in a foreign land. They have no idea that their deliverance from that second captivity in Babylon needs to be remembered alongside their deliverance from Egypt as a second Exodus, a second occasion when the Lord acted in power to return his people to the promised land. They have no idea either that at the time of Jesus, many Jews felt that even though they'd been allowed to return to their own land 500 years earlier, their land had been occupied by others throughout that time. A succession of foreign powers had set themselves over them, and it felt in many ways to the Jews as if they were still in exile. Many of them felt that they were still waiting for the Lord to rescue them. For those who felt like that, and were able to take Jesus seriously, just imagine what it must have meant when he announced, like Mark has it in Mark 1:15, "The time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God is at hand." They were able to hear Jesus telling them that their waiting time was over. Captivity now really was being consigned to the past, and their God was once more their deliverer. That's a nice place to end. We'll finish the first part of our exploration of Exodus at that point. In the second episode of our Looking at Exodus, we will briefly look at the law that's involved in the book. The Ten Commandments have an honoured place in many societies throughout the world as setting out the right way to live. The story makes it very clear that Moses was the intermediary in giving the Ten Commandments, and tradition attributes the remainder of the body of laws to Moses as well. But I think it's probably safer to assume that many of the laws arose when others continued Moses' ministry and applied it into their own situations. And we'll find strong evidence for that, for instance, when we look at the book Deuteronomy. Moses was the lawgiver. Does that mean that his basic gifting was that of a lawyer? I don't think so at all. His basic gifting was that of a prophet. In Jeremiah's words, he was one who could stand in the counsel of God and hear what God was saying about the people and about what they should be doing. But Moses also had a secondary gifting for framing the insights he'd gained prophetically in the form of a code of conduct. Other prophets didn't do that, not least because Moses had already done it and done it so well that many later prophets didn't think the laws needed changing. It was the people that needed changing in order to get them to live by the laws as they were. But don't think of the Old Testament law as some view the Ten Commandments, as a brilliant spelling out of right living for all human beings of all time. That's far too abstract. The context of the laws is God's covenant with his chosen people. The law spells out what you must do if you belong to the people of God under that covenant. It is covenant law, and in particular, Commandments 2 to 10 in the Ten Commandments are a spelling out of what it is to live under the first commandment of having the Lord as uniquely your God. So what part does the law play within the covenant? Well, the first answer has to be that it sets out the conditions which are the people's side of the covenant. It's as if they're saying to themselves, if we keep this law, then we're keeping the covenant, and therefore the covenant remains in force, it's not cancelled. The awful implication too is then that if we fail to keep the law, we're breaking the covenant, and the issue then arises whether that might get so bad that we in effect release God from his side of the covenant and we cease to be the covenant people of God. Abraham had introduced circumcision as a visible sign of who belongs to the covenant people. Moses now adds the law, much more demanding and yet more satisfying, because it puts the emphasis on both moral and spiritual issues, rather than what someone did to you with a knife when you were 8 days old, or didn't if you were female. And the rest of the story of the Old Testament is an account of the extent to which the people stuck to these laws, the trouble they got into when they failed, and God's sovereign and gracious response, especially when they failed. Although the logic is that, well, you'd better keep these laws, otherwise you could be thrown out, that logic is repeatedly broken by the God who delivers his people even from the mess that they've got into by their own stupid fault. When we come to the Prophecy of Hosea, we shall see that the Lord's attitude is that in leading his people out of Egypt, he's giving birth to a new nation whom he regards as my son. And the love which this father has for his son turns out to be even more important than the conditions he has quite rightly imposed on them in the law. And it's that love which eventually brings about the abandoning of the covenant and its replacement by the new covenant. And that is very much a to be continued, and watch this space. I don't want to prolong this here. I'm going to stop this second episode now. It's a rather short one, and then we'll continue again when you're ready. In the third episode on Exodus, we're going to major on the Tabernacle. We've noticed as in flicking through the contents of the book how many chapters are taken up with the Tabernacle. Long regulations about how the Tabernacle is to be built, and then with almost tedious repetition, further chapters describing how those regulations were each put into effect. It wouldn't be hard to do a whole teaching series on the Tabernacle, following through the connections it makes with our own worship, like replacing the altar of sacrifice with the cross. But for the moment, we've got space just for a few headlines of that sort of study. The tabernacle was to be the visible sign of the Lord living among his people. They were at this stage nomads, so the tabernacle was a tent, like they all lived in, and it moved with them. Wherever the people camped, they knew that the tabernacle was one of the tents to be set up in the centre of the camp. It's our joy to know that when we meet as a church, Jesus, the head of the church, is one of the people who meet together on that occasion. Matthew 18 verse 21, wherever people meet in Jesus' name, they can count on Jesus meeting there with them. Matthew has that remark in the context of agreeing on issues of binding and loosing, but it's often been cited in a wider connection, and I think it works in a wider connection. Free church people have frequently used it to bolster their conviction that they don't depend on bishops or church councils to make their meetings valid. If Jesus is there with them, what more do you want by way of a sign of authenticity? It's almost unbelievably blasphemous to claim that the eternal Son of God turns up at our church on a Sunday morning and becomes a part of the event there. But if it's not true, we might as well give up. And in the same sort of way, when the Israelites camped, they had the tabernacle as an assurance that the Lord had encamped with them. The main part of the tabernacle was a courtyard enclosed in tenting walls. This was not a place to gather a congregation. The only gathering involved was of the people encamped around outside the tabernacle. Their usual worship didn't involve any sort of mass gathering. The courtyard contained the main altar on which priests could offer sacrifices, most of which would be brought there by lay people. And for most people, the only regular opportunity which was offered for worship was when they brought an offering of grain or an animal to be sacrificed. Substantial parts of those sacrifices would then often be eaten either by the priests or by the lay worshippers, depended on the regulations. I think it could turn out that going into the tabernacle to worship could then turn into quite a feast, and probably the best meals that the people ever had were the ones involving meat which they had taken as a sacrifice. When you compare that with the delicate little symbolic meal which we include in our worship, you might think we've lost something. I think it's true that our turning the communion service into a ritual rather than a real meal has indeed lost something, and it's by no means obvious to me that we've been right to do that. Well, within this courtyard was a tent, the holy place. Only priests were ever allowed to go in there, and the tent contained symbols of the presence of God in the lampstand, the table of showbread, and the altar of incense. And it was a duty of a rota of priests to look after those symbols. And at the far end of the holy place, a small area within it was curtained off from the rest, and this was the most holy place, or Holy of Holies, and it contains the Ark of the Covenant, a decorated box which contained the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments were by no means the whole of the law, but they did have an honoured place which led them very obviously to be able to represent the whole of the law. And then part of the decoration of the ark was of a sort of throne on top of it, which was where they envisaged the Lord as sitting. Whilst they were in the desert, on a number of occasions Moses had to go up a mountain to meet with the Lord. And there are also stories of his going into a tent called the Tent of Meeting, erected on the outskirts of the camp, again going there to meet with the Lord. The most holy place provides in a sense an institutionalized equivalent of that Aaron, the one detailed to perform priestly functions, was the only one allowed to go into that area, and even he could only go in there upon the annual ritual of atonement. In later years, high priests were appointed, only one at a time, in effect as the successors to Aaron, and only the high priest was allowed to go into the Holy of Holies, and that only on the Day of Atonement. And when in 1973 an Arab coalition invaded Israel on the Day of Atonement, we all learned the Hebrew for it, Yom Kippur. One little detail: the ark was carried on the shoulders of Levites by means of poles threaded through rings in the sides of the ark. The instruction is that when the ark was placed in the Holy of Holies, those poles were not to be removed. This could well have been to avoid people having to touch the ark in order to thread in the poles when it was time to move on. But it had the odd consequence that when the ark was in place in the Holy of Holies, the poles stuck out through the curtain which separated it from the holy place. So the priests doing their regular duties in the holy place would be able to see those poles sticking through the curtains and have a reminder of the awesome presence of God just the other side of that curtain. I think it feels to me that this is very much like those gospel stories when Jesus announces to people that the kingdom of God is upon you. It's right on top of you. It's creeping up on you. If you haven't noticed it, it's because you haven't opened your eyes, because the clear signs of it are right there in front of you. Well, that curtain or veil is an important symbol in the making of the new covenant under which we live. When the temple was built in place of the tabernacle, it was built on essentially the same design as the tabernacle, a more elaborate version of it, but the holy place and the Holy of Holies surrounded by courtyards, that basic pattern was there. And even though most of the structure was then of wood and stone, the separation between the holy place and the most holy place was still provided by a curtain, the veil of the temple, if you like. And when Jesus died on the cross, Mark records in chapter 15, verse 38, that at that moment the curtain of the temple was torn in two from the top to the bottom. It was a very high curtain. The temple was built on a grand scale, and the curtain was made of very thick material. That it was torn from the top to the bottom meant that God did it. Human beings could not reach the top without erecting some sort of scaffolding or staging so that they could climb up there. The curtain had the job of separating off the place where God lived as somewhere where only one man could ever go. Even ordinary priests had to be content with the sight of those poles sticking through the curtain. But when the curtain was torn in two, it no longer separated the most holy place from the holy place. From that point on, any priest going into the holy place was in the same room as the one where God lived. That is, the result of the death of Jesus is that all believers have the same access to the Lord. We do not have particular Christians who by virtue of their office have an access to God which is denied to the rest of us, which is the basic idea of priesthood. No, if one Christian has a greater access to God than others, it's probably because they've taken the trouble to draw near to God more than others have. Well, that situation was established when the Son of God was shown to the world in a very public place, hanging on a cross. And once God had been that open about revealing himself in public, it could no longer make any sense at all to think of him shut away in a little room on his own, access to which was carefully regulated by the rules and procedures of a formal religion. The new made that sort of thing very old. It's easy for us to say that when the old religion being criticized by it is someone else's religion. It's easier for us to say it about the Jewish religion. It's not really any harder if it's the Catholics we're criticising, or even the Anglicans, or whichever churches seem distinctly different from the one that we belong to. But it's also very important to say it about our own brand of Christianity. If our sort of church falls into the habit of hedging about access to God with rules and regulations, then we become part of the old. We are in effect challenging the Lord to put something new in our place. May it never happen, not on our watch. Well, the theology of Exodus. What does Exodus tell us about God? He takes people as his own, and this applied originally to a specific small race, but by a route which we'll explore as we journey. It's come to include us who belong to Jesus. As we've seen with Noah, he has a concern that his people should live in a manner which befits their being his people, and through the ministry of Moses a large body of details is attached to that idea. And when his people go astray, he doesn't just abandon them and start again with some other people. God doesn't then go off in a huff. He is the God who rescues his people from the mess that they've got themselves into. That's prefigured in a way in Noah's Ark. But in the book of Exodus, it's writ large in the deliverance from Egypt. And that is the Old Testament's leading example of God rescuing his people. What does Exodus then tell us about being God's people? Well, first it tells us that we have a history of being rescued by God. To tell our history is to tell salvation history, or if you're a German speaker, to tell of Heilsgeschichte. We do not have a history other than one which centres on God rescuing us from the mess that we've made of our lives and of our world. And as a result of that, it's not too much to say that we owe our lives to God. No surprise then that he expects us to respond by dedicating our lives to him, to live in covenant obligation to him, just as he's shown himself to be in covenant obligation to us. And the law of Moses, which begins in Exodus, is the first main move in spelling out the terms of that obligation. The logic is clear. This is what God tells his people to do. Do it and you'll be living properly in your covenant relationship to God. Fail to do it and you'll be putting a strain on that relationship, possibly even rupturing it. And we'll explore more details of that logic when we come to more of the law in the book of Leviticus. But lastly, one part of our covenant obligation is our obligation to worship the Lord. The tabernacle is a focus of the Lord's presence among his people wherever they go. And the covenanted presence of God with his people requires that we respond in part by worshipping him. And again, more later, especially when we come to the books of Psalms and Chronicles. But that brings us to the end of our study for the time being of the book of Exodus.